This video is sponsored by Nvidia. When you think of cutting-edge graphics in games, you probably think of AAA titles, since they have the biggest teams and budgets. But with so much money on the line, and the need for the largest audiences possible, these sorts of projects have to play it safe, sticking to tried and tested graphical technologies, advancing slowly, and ensuring that the vast majority of gamers and their PCs will be able to run the game on release day. But remix projects, such as Half-Life 2 RTX, shown here, can have features, technologies and system requirements that can be many years ahead of the rest of the industry. Because everybody has played Half-Life 2 already. The entire point of a mod like Half-Life 2 RTX is to show the game we know and love already, but in a new light, quite literally, depicting a classic game in a way that has never been seen before. And that opens up a lot of exciting possibilities. Half-Life 2 RTX is not just a mod that's been developed using Remix. The mod has, in return, helped to shape Remix, and thanks to the back and forth between the modding team and Nvidia's engineers, the platform now sports new features and graphical techniques, which enable Remix to become an even better platform for future mods to be based upon. The magic of Remix comes from its use of full path tracing. This isn't just being used for the sake of it, it's the very reason the Remix modding platform can work. Games have traditionally used cheats and shortcuts to simulate lighting and reflection, so by swapping that all out for a fully dynamic, self-contained lighting system, RTX projects are no longer constrained by their original engine's limitations, and it gives modders an unprecedented amount of freedom and flexibility to craft their own depictions of those games. I talked to David, lead of the Half-Life 2 RTX project, and he revealed the fascinating stories behind all of the cool, cutting-edge stuff the mod is currently using. This video looks to explore the symbiotic relationship between the Half-Life 2 RTX project and the Remix platform that it's based upon. With this collaboration, Nvidia have been given an invaluable resource, being an enthusiastic and talented modding team who want their game to look the absolute best that it can. And so by working closely together, it enables Nvidia to test out new and upcoming technologies and to iron out issues in a low-risk environment. Stuff like RTX skin. And if these technologies are deemed a success, you could see these effects rolled out to the rest of the industry, eventually even becoming standard features seen in next-gen's AAA titles. But until then, we get to see it in Half-Life 2 RTX, which is a community project comprising of people who are simply passionate about Half-Life 2. It started life with a bunch of separate modding teams who all looked at each other and realised they were all doing roughly the same thing and could get more done if they combined forces. Because if you're all working on the same game towards a similar goal, then why do the same work multiple times separately? Previously, there was the Half-Life 2 VR team, who were looking to make higher quality assets for the game, since in VR your face can get much closer to stuff, so you benefit from there being more detail. The Half-Life 2 Remade Assets team is quite self-explanatory. They were attempting to bring the visual quality of Half-Life 2 up to the quality seen in Half-Life Alyx, in order to provide modders for the game a robust library of high-quality assets. There was the Project 17 team, who were looking to remake the opening chapter of Half-Life 2 in Half-Life Alyx, which again meant creating higher quality assets for the game. And the Raising the Bar Redux team was looking to modernise the look of Half-Life 2. These 4 Half-Life 2 mods had so many overlapping goals that they decided to collaborate for Half-Life 2 RTX, under the name Orbifold Studios. Then once this is finished, they'll use all the assets made for this for their own individual project again. Apart from Raising the Bar Redux, they're just along for the ride. David says the team behind Half-Life 2 RTX is now one of the biggest modding teams of all time, but then he backtracked and said that some others would still be larger, like if you account for all the voice actors in a project like Skyblivion. But still, Half-Life 2 RTX is up there. After years of collaboration and hard work, the Half-Life 2 RTX demo was finally released, and while its visuals were undeniably stunning, its style was off, and this was reflected in the complaints the demo received, with people complaining bits of it looked wrong, especially this scene showing Grigori's dramatic entrance. It looked as though Orbifold Studios was overdoing the brightness of everything, thinking more was better, but that wasn't the case. Turns out, fire is actually quite bright, but simulating stuff correctly can sometimes make these scenes look wrong, because there's more to overhauling a game than simply improving the graphic simulation. It's also important to faithfully capture the feel of the original, even if it is ultimately fake or artificial in its appearance. So based on this feedback they received from the demo's release, Orbifold issued a patch redoing all of the lighting to bring it closer to that of the original game, and it boiled down to having more control over the lighting, fog and fire properties. So the team requested from Nvidia per light source controls within the Remix editor in order to more closely recreate Half-Life 2's artistic direction with those elements. And they achieved this by adding a volumetric radiance scale to each light source to change how intense the resulting fog and volumetric effects created by each light within the game would be. This gave the team much greater control over the look of the effects, especially during the iconic Grigori entrance scene. This hacks the laws of physics a bit, with David stating that it was a case-by-case analysis of, did the original developers make it look the way they did on purpose, or was it from hardware constraints at the time? The original version of Ravenholm contained fake spotlights and god rays to botch these effects into the game. Now, the Half-Life 2 RTX team was approaching this challenge from the other direction, by having all these effects in place for real but needing to botch their values in order to make them look aesthetically more like the artificial methods in which they have been done with originally. And this is the result. This room, initially looking substantially brighter when path tracing was applied to it, has now had its light's brightness tweaked to combine the best of both worlds. It retains the original's dark, moody atmosphere, but with the accurate, real-time lighting of Remix. And the blinding volumetric fog in this example has been cleared away, whilst still preserving the effect up above, which was likely an artistically driven decision in the original to do justice to the dramatic Grigori introduction. Given that these flames are dynamic, the baked-in cube maps of the original Half-Life 2 weren't able to reflect them in the surrounding materials. Remix, being fully path traced, does all this automatically, and in my opinion, adds something major that was missing from the original due to the technological constraints of the time. I can imagine greater control over the lighting properties will help them out in other bits of the game as well, like the spotlight-heavy attack on Nova Prospect, which also happens to contain lots of foggy, hazy, fiery effects. So really, it's all about striking the perfect balance, where everything is done for real, but remains faithful to the artistic intention of the original version of the game as closely as possible. David explained to me the problem with trying to modernise a 20-year-old game. These older games had simple textures and geometry. Sure, you can make the textures higher in resolution, but it'll still just look like a high-res texture in a low-res game, like this cat meme that you've probably seen before. For an old game to stand the test of time, you've got to somehow make the environment look higher in quality, more bumpy and more 3D. The best way of doing this would be to replace the old, outdated geometry with much higher quality 3D models. Each and every one of them tailor-made for each and every spot in the map. But even for a team as big as Orbifold's is, the amount of work involved in doing this for every surface in a game the size of Half-Life 2's is infeasible. Plus the file sizes would be insane. So instead, what if they could just replace the old textures with new, high-res ones with a 3D looking appearance? That way they could redo huge sections of every level with just a handful of texture replacements. It was because of this that the team proposed to Nvidia that they introduced parallax occlusion mapping into Remix, or POM for short. I'm going to be calling it that a lot in this video because the full name is quite a mouthful and I can't pass on the opportunity to pom-pom all over the place. So what are POMs? Here is a flat surface, high in texture detail, convincing in its material shaders, but far too flat to pass as a surface in a modern game. Now here it is, but with parallaxed depth. It's still just 2D, but it looks 3D, unless you turn the effect up way too high, as I'm doing here, in which case the illusion breaks down. But still, being able to remix old levels with POMmed materials is a complete game changer, and with correct usage can transform a 20-year-old game up to cutting-edge graphical standards, and using just a tiny fraction of the manpower that would be required to 3D model every surface for real. So adding this feature to Remix was essential in order for them to be able to bring Half-Life 2 up to cutting-edge graphical standards. Not that parallax maps are a new technology. To my knowledge, it was first used in a fully 3D game about 20 years ago in the game Fear, and it was used there to make bullet holes look 3D. I was obsessed with it when the game came out, and apparently so were the developers. Why else would the holes be about 100 times bigger than they should have been? But I'll forgive them, because it looked awesome. Some of the surfaces in the original Oblivion used it too, like on the stone bricks in the jail cell at the beginning, or on these weird bits inside the caves, and on some of the rocks that you might have encountered outside. More recently, if you've been playing Counter-Strike 2, then you might have noticed far more realistically sized 3D looking bullet holes on the surfaces, which appear to stick into or out of the surface they're on. Parallax occlusion maps are a much more convenient way of giving the illusion of 3D than to actually make a 3D hole into a surface. So that's how Overhaul Studios used POMs, as a way to easily modernise the background scenery, freeing up more time for modelers to dedicate on properly 3D modelling the props and assets which mattered the most. Then they could lavish finishing touches like the grass and building trims in proper 3D, and just like that, modern day Half-Life 2. There's just One problem: a POM'd surface is still 2D at heart, and Remix uses path tracing, which bounces rays about in 3D and likes to do things properly. So how can path tracing authentically interact with a 2D surface that's merely pretending to be 3D? Luckily, you don't have to bother yourself with that problem. Some clever NVIDIA engineers figured out a way of getting rays to bounce into a parallax material as though it was fully 3D. The rays then bounce around inside the surface and can eventually even bounce out of it again, just like if the surface had been 3D for real. This is quite profound. It means that a flat surface can cast shadows within itself. In extreme examples, if the surface is deep enough, it can actually absorb more light that falls into it, instead of just bouncing it straight out again to light up the surrounding area. The team experimented with Kleiner's lab as a prototype for this, and with POM in place, the Half-Life 2 RTX team finally had the tools they needed at their disposal to create the project the way they had envisioned. It popped, and even subtle 3D depth added a huge amount of authenticity to how the environments looked. David told me that POM was incredible and really heightened what they could hope to achieve from their project. That even if they'd only used it on the brick surfaces, it would still have been worth adding to the project, given how, with just a few remade textures, entire rooms, buildings and environments can be transformed, bringing Half-Life 2 forward 20 years in an instant. Another reason for why parallax occlusion maps are such a great feature to add to Remix is because the goal of Remix was to make it accessible to modders, many of whom may not have access to nor experience in expensive and specialised modding tools. With POM, it opens up the possibility of creating detailed 3D surfaces to more people, since you don't need to be a 3D modeler to be able to use it in your mod. When I say it saves on resources, it is still a balancing act, and the approach you take to remixing a game depends on the number of people you have developing it. If you're just a lone individual wanting to remix Half-Life 2, then you probably will need to use AI to generate the materials and displacement maps, because there wouldn't be enough time in your life to do it all properly. Whereas if you have a modding team of 100,000 people, then you could probably just 3D model every face of every level uniquely, without the need for parallax occlusion maps whatsoever. But as it was, with a dev team of just over 100, the balance the Half-Life 2 RTX team settled on was to handcraft every texture, but then to use POM to give it a 3D appearance. They did this by modelling the texture in full 3D before importing it into Blender and then using that program to convert it all into a POM material for Remix to use. And for the smaller modding teams without so many resources or 3D modelling experience, they can use a program like Substance Designer to paint the height maps onto a texture and see the updated POM'd result in Remix in real time. Once all this is done, you can adjust how extreme the 3D effect is within the Remix software, but sometimes more is less. Luckily, just a bit of 3D is all that's needed to transform a surface into a convincing and lifelike material. I was curious to know how much performance is freed up from using POM instead of a fully modelled 3D wall, and the answer surprised me. David told me there wasn't much difference, because even though parallax occlusion mapped surfaces are just a couple of polygons, while a fully 3D modelled one could be millions, in the grand scale of things, it's the path tracing that dwarfs the performance overhead that a surface comes with. And since it's behaving the same way whether the surface is 3D or parallax occlusion mapped, it doesn't make a big difference to how quickly the game runs. One thing that POM does help with though is file size. The POM'd 4K texture is about 10 megabytes in size, compared with a fully 3D modelled version which would feature millions of polygons, and it could be many times bigger than 10 megabytes in file size. I was curious to know what the drawbacks of parallax occlusion maps over proper 3D were, and 20 years on since parallax became a thing, the issue with it is still the silhouette correction, because it is still just a 2D surface. So it's possible to create instances where the geometry is impossible, like where it gets sucked behind a surface that's also behind the other surface. You can make parallax occlusion maps stick in or out, but the Half-Life 2 RTX team chose just to stick it into the surface, as it's harder to break that way. So this was a dev choice, but you could choose to have the parallax occlusion map have spikes sticking out of the ground if you wanted to. But just know that the illusion could break in certain angles, as I'm demonstrating here. Translucency. When you think of translucencies, you mostly think of glass and water, and he showed me how easy it is to change the index of refraction in Remix, which adjusts how much it refracts the light passing through the object. He says that a value of 1.3 is the accepted industry standard for a thick pane of glass. I never even knew there would be an industry standard for something so specific. He also showed me thin-walled, which just means there are reflections on the surface, but no refraction going through it. More things have translucent properties than you might first think. For instance, the ivy and grass just here. They're not translucent in the sense that you can see through them, but they are transmissive, meaning that light can still pass through them to some extent. changing brightness and colour and projecting shadows through the object, as you can see on these ivy leaves just here. A nice example of how natural this can look is with this lampshade, now emitting light through it, which will then go on to light up the surrounding environment in a softer and more natural way, as you can see on the wall just here. Or with this gorgeous statue, made out of a transmissive material that now lights up and reveals its interior colours and structure. Which gets us onto skin. Now, skin is a whole new level of rendering challenge because it isn't just a surface that light can bounce off or pass through. A considerable amount of light bounces into the skin and then out again, giving a waxier, more translucent look to parts of faces, and it's why ears and the like get a reddish appearance when you're viewing a bright light source through them. Without a way to accurately simulate this, Orbifold Studios ran into difficulties making characters like Grigori look authentic, and Nvidia provided Remix with support for RTX Skin, which was an experimental technology the company had been working on for this exact sort of challenge. It transforms the skin from being a painted-on texture to appearing to have waxy depth to it. The way it does this is with a subsurface scattering map, which tells Remix how translucent every point on a face is. The path tracing then uses this map as a guide, as light enters and then exits the material again. With humans, they had to be very careful about the amount of subsurface scattering they introduced, because we humans are very picky when it comes to determining how convincing another human looks. But since we're not so familiar with how aliens are supposed to look, the Remix team had great fun messing with funkier values when it came to adding RTX skin to their head crabs, which is why they look so gelatinous and soapy. Don't you just want to lick them? Don't lick them. This scene here happens to be one of the best showcases I could find to show what subsurface scattering's actually doing. If I completely disable it, you'll see that the head crab skin goes from being lit up to being in the shade. Now, as I increase the subsurface scattering, where the shadows begin starts to become more fuzzy. This is because where the light meets the shadow, a lot of the light actually passes a bit through the flesh first, ricocheting about inside the head crab before passing back out again to our eyes, revealing the head crab's inner colours. Disgusting. Gorgeous. Gorgeously disgusting. If I then turn the value way beyond what it should be, it's almost as though the head crab gets darker, as though all the light that hits the head crab just carries on going through it until it's passed through the creature the other side, like a dirty sort of jelly. Ew. Now the opposite situation can be seen here, where because the flashlight in Half-Life 2 RTX seems to emit light from Gordon Freeman's pelvis, here it's lighting up the ground beneath the head crab, so without subsurface scattering, the head crab acts as a solid surface and none of the light from beneath it can bleed through it. But then, as I increase the subsurface scattering amount, the head crab begins to light up like a Christmas tree. A forbidden Christmas tree that's entombed in dirty jelly. Ew. And this is what happens to a human model if you ramp the subsurface scattering up to maximum. The sacrifice you make by creating a mod that requires powerful graphical hardware is that it will limit who can run it. For now, at least. Like I said at the start, AAA titles are careful to allow as many people to run them on release day as possible, compared with Half-Life 2 RTX, which, with its requirement of full path tracing, is greatly restricting who can experience Remix mods. And its mixed ratings on Steam reflect that, with people complaining that they aren't getting great performance or can't run it at all. It's just an unfortunate reality when you're working with the latest technologies. You might remember the Portal RTX mod. The environments in that game were much smaller and simpler, and because of that they were able to lavish every surface with a huge amount of textural detail. They aim for a certain number of pixels per inch, and the textures in Portal RTX are, on average, 4 times more detailed than Half-Life 2 RTXs are, which is insane to consider, given how well the surfaces in Half-Life 2 hold up when under intense scrutiny. So whereas a AAA title would be made with an easily attainable minimum hardware spec in mind, with Half-Life 2 RTX they just went about making the whole game to a high standard and then set about trying to establish what the minimum recommended graphics card spec would be that could run it. They settled on the 8GB RTX 3060 Ti as being the minimum spec for a playable experience in this game. What you're seeing here is gameplay recorded on a 3060 Ti, so you can see what minimum spec performance is like. David told me they aimed for 30 FPS with a certain degree of image quality, which meant experimenting with different quality settings and upscaling options until they struck a balance that they were happy with. And even that wasn't easy. DLSS upscaling, for example, comes in 2 different varieties. There's CNN, which is the older but faster to run model, and DLSS Transformer, which looks better but is more demanding for older generations of card to run. But DLSS is a technology that's being continually worked on and improved, and even at this early stage of development, David says that visually it already matches or beats the older CNN model in every situation he's tested it in. And these developments won't just benefit the latest graphics cards and future games. Portal RTX just received an update to include the latest DLSS technologies, which will help extract more performance and image quality from your graphics card, be it the superior transformer upscaling models or the frame gen tech supported by the RTX 4000 and 5000 series of cards. One new feature that all RTX cards will benefit from, and should see framerate boosts by using, is the inclusion of Neural Radiance Cache, which makes path tracing easier to handle by training AI on it as it goes along to better simulate the indirect lighting. Since AI is lighter to run than path tracing is, this has the benefit of making the game look better and it runs faster. So the entirety of Remix is still improving and evolving, and they're finding clever ways to extract more out of less than ever before. And add to that, graphical hardware is improving every generation, with new features like FrameGen helping every tier of hardware hit frame rates that were previously impossible. And the community has played an important part in this as well, and Nvidia have been astonished by the ingenious ways in which members of the community have managed to get Remix working with games and engines that they never thought would have been compatible with Remix. As an example, they recently found a way of getting Left 4 Dead 2 to play nicely with it. It really feels like the sky's the limit, and it's thanks to the hard work and passion of community modders such as Orbifold Studios that Remix has become what it is today. And Nvidia have partnered up with ModDB to host a $50,000 RTX Remix mod contest, which challenges the community to create imaginative and beautiful looking mods of their own. If you want to try it for yourself or simply want to browse current submissions, then check it out in the link in this video's description.